that probably has never been more important than it is today. I guess we about got it right, since well over 200 of you have signed up to participate in this webinar. Most of you on this call know how important camp is for our community. And again, probably never more important than it is today. Rather sadly, many in our community are unable to afford camp. And that's particularly true today when the financial constraints that all of us are operating under are really biting. So I will ask you, if any of you knows of anyone who could use our support and send their child to camp, please get in touch with us. Similarly, if any of you would like to help us support those in our community, also please get in touch with us. Now with that, I will turn it over to one of tonight's speakers, Elise Wulff.
Thank you, Jeffrey. It's a pleasure to be here. So I would love to take this opportunity to welcome everyone who's joining us, and what a privilege it is, if I can speak on behalf of Eric and Debbie, to bring the MGH Aspire and the Camp Akeela worlds together for this opportunity. To set out our plan for this evening, wanting to practice what we preach with structure and organization, and helping you to predict how this evening's flow will go. A little bit of housekeeping to start off with. For starters, we will be muting all participants upon entry, so it's nothing personal. Also, we will be offering a recording of the content of this for individuals who are not able to join us tonight. So knowing that, please feel free, if you'd like to take a moment, to change your name if you would not like your name to show up in the webinar. We will be using speaker view. Additionally, if you'd like to, we would ask that everyone please mute your video, and this will help protect the bandwidth. We are expecting a very large crowd tonight, and we'd like everyone to be able to see all and hear all of the content as clearly as possible. Eric has graciously offered to moderate our chat feature and to be in control of the Q&A at the end. So as you have questions while we're speaking, please use the chat feature and send them directly to Eric. He has changed his name to remind you that he is the one to send questions to, Eric Sasson. Eric will be watching the chats, looking for themes, and at the end, when we get to our Q&A portion, he will pull together some of the concepts that really came up and that resonated with people during the chat. A topic outlined for tonight, Debbie and I will be speaking about why we set limits in neurodiversity, how to set limits, and then some visual tools to support limits before we get to the Q&A. Thank you. So a little bit about me. I won't bore you with all of this, but something here that I think might interest you to know about me that is not listed in my bio is that one of my favorite flavor combinations is cottage cheese and honey.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Debbie Sasson. It is also lovely to join you, and thank you so much, Elise, for partnering with us as well. Let's see. I do want to say before I introduce myself that it is pouring here in Philadelphia, which is where we're based, and we are really crossing our fingers that we don't lose power. But if you hear the rain, please forgive me. Anyway, besides that, something that is not here in my bio that you can't read is that I was a very reluctant camper for all 5 summers or so, my first 5 summers of sleepaway camp. I was probably one of the most homesick campers at camp, and that's something that I didn't put in my bio for everyone. So now you know.
And hello, everybody. I'm Eric. I will be behind the scenes running the chat, as Elise said. A little bit about me basically just says I like camp a lot. I'm a real camp guy. I was never homesick. I just couldn't wait to get back to camp. I was pretty much camp sick for 10 months. And you can see here, Debbie and I met at camp. But one thing that's not in my bio that I think you may want to know about me is that my parents also met at camp when they were 15 and 17 years old. So I'm very much a camp guy through and through.
Awesome. So I'm going to start us off tonight talking about the meat of our topic. And I let's see, I'm seeing everyone right now. I'm going to change that. Sorry. I have always thought that this is a really important topic because as parents, I feel, and as Eric mentioned, we're parents ourselves. Our job is to keep our kids safe at all times. And we're also trying to raise decent human beings who will one day be okay without us. And it often feels like we're sort of going against our natural instincts to protect our kids when we create situations that actually make them struggle. So I believe that we really need to shift our notion of what our roles are as parents. And I think that we need to help our kids work through struggles, because that's what really enables them to grow and to be independent and resilient. There's so much research out there right now about grit and raising children with grit. And if you haven't already, I highly encourage you to look at any of the books or papers written by Angela Duckworth. She's really amazing. And in fact, Eric and I were really lucky enough to hear her speak at one of the biggest gatherings of camp professionals a few years ago. And we already knew before, but it was really apparent during that conversation with Angela Duckworth that camp is a perfect example of how we can really sort of push our kids beyond what their comfort levels are. Camp in and of itself, and I'm a camp person, so I'm using camp as my point of reference, but there are other examples as well, but camps in particular force kids to step out of their comfort zones. Especially for children with ASD or NVLD, sticking with what's comfortable and familiar is always a first choice. Every time I talk to a new camper, they usually tell me no, I'm fine. I'm just going to stay home this summer because it's safe and it's familiar. If we were to allow our children and our prospective campers to keep doing what makes them feel safest, they might never figure out what they're actually capable of beyond what's comfortable. They might not learn new skills, they might not make new friends, and they might not try new foods, for example. But I think it's really important to recognize that being uncomfortable does not mean that our kids are unsafe. There's a big difference. And this comes up at camp a lot, and I think Eric's going to put up a slide. We are lucky enough at Akeela to have a high ropes course. And kids get to really push themselves through things that feel uncomfortable. We go into great detail about how strong our cables are. In fact, we tell our kids, and this is actually true, the cables that create our zip line can hold a full school bus, filled with people. And when we tell our kids that, they're really surprised. We're putting them in equipment that's going to make them feel safe. That doesn't mean that they won't feel uncomfortable, though. It's really scary to climb up 30 feet. And so we really think it's important to teach our children the difference between feeling uncomfortable and feeling unsafe. As parents, we of course want to keep our children safe. We would never put them in a situation that's unsafe, but that's very different from putting them into a situation that's uncomfortable. Camp is an example of how we can push kids to do things in a way that's going to help them develop grit. They have to sleep in a new place. They have to share space with 10 other people or so. They have to swim in a lake that might have fish in it, that might be cold. They might have to eat foods that aren't prepared by the same person or in a way that's familiar with them. And do things that are more obvious, like this: climbing a rock wall, going on a hike, doing the zip line, things like that. Things like this for many of our children, and sometimes for many of us, seem impossible. More often for our kids, they don't seem necessary. Why would I want to put myself in a situation where I'm going to feel uncomfortable? But when we encourage anyone to do something that they think they can't do or that they say they won't do, then they see at the end that they can do it. When they're successful, they realize that it just takes a leap of faith and it's worth it in the end. The more they try something and the more they experience the success with things that they might have previously not preferred, they get better and better at that. And then the next time they're more likely to try something that's not familiar. So for us as parents, while it feels uncomfortable for us to push our children to do things that are really difficult, and it takes a lot of effort, which we're going to talk about on our part as parents, at the end, the push is actually what creates the growth. And I put this photo up here. This is our older daughter a number of years ago playing piano. And this is an example of a small push, but one where playing piano was challenging, required work, required effort, and it also required pushing through failure. And yet, when we continued to push her to do it, she then felt a great deal of success when there were moments where she could complete a task or perform for others successfully. And those are the types of things that we're going to talk about as ways to encourage children to grow and to develop that grit. Elise?
Thank you. So tonight, one thing that if we can make the assumption that there's a commonality here, it's that we're talking about limits and neurodiversity. So I'm in complete agreement with everything that Debbie said, and I think conversations that Debbie, Eric, and I have had is also just the complication of doing this for a population that we acknowledge will experience more struggle, will encounter more opportunities where their fight or flight response is going to be activated, or where the social competency, the stress management, the organization, the self-awareness, that there might be an additional barrier here. And so we wanted to talk specifically about neurodiversity and limits. And this is an image that, as you can see at the bottom, credit given to the individuals who created this blog, Michelle Swan and Erin Human. We're Debbie, Eric, and I are part of a community. I don't believe in reinventing the wheel. I think we make progress by standing on the shoulders of the work and the organization that others have done. So I really appreciate this visual. So for those of you that are new to the idea of neurodiversity, I think this might help you break it down a little bit. But when we talk about neurodiversity and limits, specifically we want to think about, we do have to be more thoughtful and we do have to be more methodical, recognizing that we have a population vulnerable to some concerns with self-esteem. These are individuals that are putting grit forward on a day-to-day basis in ways that those of us that identify as neurotypical as much as anyone does, that we don't have that empathic experience of recognizing that it might take more grit, more effort, more motivation to get out of bed and go to school, recognizing that you have a predisposition to being stressed or anxious throughout the day, or that you will encounter social challenges. And, if you don't mind, next slide, Eric. When it comes to setting expectations for the neurodiverse population, this is going to be our starting point in thinking about how we can empower and educate parents and professionals to, as Debbie said earlier, reframe our responsibility when it comes to limits as one of empowerment, one of progress, and one of setting high expectations for the people that we care so much about. So 3 concepts that I think we want to put in the toolbox of when we need a reminder of why it's important to set limits for a population that we acknowledge might experience some struggles that we're not aware of. The first one is education. So there's plenty of research and literature to suggest that the neurodiverse population, specifically high cognitive autism, autism spectrum disorders, ADHD, and VLD and related social cognitive profiles, need explicit instruction. And another thing that we can tack on to that is that there's some literature to suggest that the time from introduction of a concept to mastery is about 3 years. So that's a long runway. And when you put these 2 concepts together, there's an understanding that we do have to have a really methodical approach to educating our population about how they can best interact with the world around them and how they can experience and how they can grow skills so that they don't encounter barriers later on. So we need to take an explicit instruction approach, and we need to recognize there's a longer runway from the time that we introduce a skill to the time that our individuals will be doing it competently, confidently, and independently. The second concept is self-concept. So self-determination and self-esteem. So kids, I don't have to say that more than once to this crowd, kids are always listening, kids are always watching, and they're picking up a lot of cues from their environment, whether we want them to or not. One of these cues is how their providers, caregivers, parents, clinicians think about their skill set. So this idea of a parent or a caregiver sending a message to a child about whether they can or can't do something lives very deeply. When we're over supporting, or when we're not taking that long range goal of what's the next step to you doing this for yourself, what's the next step to me binding your experience with some limits, what we are also saying there is that I don't think you can do it. I don't think you can handle limits. I don't think you can handle this challenge. And I don't think that's the case. Debbie, Eric, and I work with a group of caregivers and parents that you're giving your children these experiences because you see them having unlimited potential. And I think that's one of the reasons that we partnered with CampLauncher to bring you this topic. And then lastly, it's experience. As Debbie said earlier, there's this razor thin edge between uncomfortable and unsafe, especially for a population whose fight or flight response kicks in almost instantaneously to novel experiences. So what we want to do is give our individuals the opportunity over time to expand that range of discomfort and recognize that there is space before you get to unsafe. You might live through some momentary short-term discomfort, and that experience teaches you that that is tolerable and that is growth. So the physiological experience of learning for our population is also something we have to normalize. What is it like in my brain and my body to take on a new experience and feel like I can slowly chip away at where I am now and where I'd like to be when I become more independent doing this? So caregiver role and expectations. Is it asking too much of children to do things that are hard and challenging? No. How do we know as parents we're being unreasonable? We don't. So those are the two most helpful things I think we'll say tonight. Moving on. So, to be honest, I didn't mean to be flip about those last two comments. I think it's normalizing that we're not going to give you those answers tonight, and this is just a lifelong process that we've been pursuing for years. And so we do want to normalize that this is a growth edge for everyone, specifically learning alongside your child. So some things that can help to structure when you think about setting expectations, which would allow you to set limits for your child. The 6 steps up here are the big picture process we think about when we're introducing an individual to a new skill or a new experience. Conceptual understanding and modeling. As Debbie mentioned, this cable can hold a school bus. So helping to make sure that their concept of this activity is accurate. Highly controlled, contrived practice. Do you need a checklist of what it looks like to do a ropes course? Do you want to watch a video of someone doing it? Do you want to watch someone go first? Observations of natural settings in real time, recognizing that the video of someone doing a ropes course may not look exactly like the ropes course you're going to do today, and let's lean into that. Mapping the scaffolding. What kind of supports do we need to get you on the course today? Walking across the bridge tomorrow. Goal-directed supported practice, so a commonality between Akeela and Aspire is that we talk to their kids because they're there with us. So we're going to talk about the goal of getting on the ropes course, the goal of getting in a canoe today, the goal of introducing yourself to a new camper. And then lastly, reflection and reinforcement, making sure that these baby steps that we're acknowledging towards the goal, again, might be uncomfortable and you're not unsafe. And at the bottom here, some considerations for setting realistic expectations. This is more as we're talking about what's the skill that I should expect my child to be able to do. We do want to go back to some developmentally appropriate age frames. Building the foundation, so make sure that any skill your child can do the single steps in it before they can do more than one step at the same time. Existing data, what data do you have about their investment or experience with this skill in the past? Transparency. Talk to them, see what their thoughts are about it. Also share your perspective. And then lastly, authentic communication. So using words like, yeah, this might be a little uncomfortable when we get up there. And recognizing that the discomfort and growth is not a solvable scenario. So I don't plan on going into this today because I think Debbie, Eric, and I could do an entire lecture series on when to pick a battle. But some questions to ask yourself if you're at the point where you've set the expectation, and now this phrase of pick a battle, what we're really about to get into is how do you follow through? So you've set the expectation, and when we're talking about a limit, really the space between the expectation and the limit is that we're trying to get follow through. We're trying to maintain some consistency of these expectations and binding anxiety and experience with some limits. So these are just some questions to frame if you want to talk to a provider, talk to one of your camp directors, talk to someone about how do I start this process of thinking about expectations and limits for my child. These are just some questions to roll around in your mind and talk about.
Great, thank you. So this is a big topic. I mean, I think, Elise and Eric and I all recognize that. And it's a big one because it's important and it comes up in very small ways and very big ways also. And so I'm going to talk a little bit more about the why of setting limits, and then Elise is going to finish by really getting into the nitty-gritty of the how. But, we, in addition to having our camp with children during the summer, we also have a week of family camp, and I know some of my family camp friends are on the call tonight. And we have an opportunity every day at family camp to meet just as parents to talk about things that come up for everyone. And this topic of how and when to set limits is the topic that comes up first and most frequently because it's a big one. So we want to recognize that. Parents often ask us, is the struggle worth it? Is it worth being in the grocery store and having my kid have a temper tantrum because I refuse to buy the sugar cereal? And that's a judgment call. There's no right or wrong answer. It's about your comfort level with your sort of discomfort and sitting with that discomfort. And that's not something that the three of us can answer for you. That's something that you need to check in with yourself about, and also with your partner that you're parenting with if you have a partner. So I want to encourage you to just jot a note down, to really think about that. And if you are parenting with a partner, to talk about it with that person or people, because I think that's an important factor. If your child constantly has, meltdowns in certain settings, how are you going to address that? Or are you just not going to bring that child to that setting anymore? Again, those are choices that we value as being your own. And we're not going to give you advice about that. But I will just put in one plug here for sort of the behavioral principle around all of this, which is to say that however we respond to our children's behaviors, whether they're positive or negative, we're going to reinforce them. So if you don't buy the sugar cereal that one time in the grocery store and they have a temper tantrum and then you change your mind and end up buying the Lucky Charms, I get it. And you're reinforcing that it takes a temper tantrum to get Lucky Charms. And so the next time you're in the grocery store and you decide to put your foot down, the tantrum is going to be bigger. That's just behavior 101. Again, it's not a judgment, it's just sort of science. My behavioral friends have told me that it takes 3 times to create a habit and 7 times to break a habit. So if we can set up really good practices ahead of time, there's more of a chance that we won't fall into some of the traps where we're reinforcing the negative behaviors, but we're instead reinforcing the positive ones. And I think that's a good goal as parents. So, a lot of times parents come to camp and they pick up their kids and they're like, oh my gosh, how did you get him to shower? I can't get him to shower at home. These are our, 15-year-old boys or girls. Or he refuses to swim with us when we go to the town pool, but you told me he swam every day. I kind of don't believe you. How did you do that? And I'm going to start by saying, and I know Elise will agree, there are some like unicorns that exist at camp, which is to say that there are some magical things about being a camp director or camp counselor because we're not parents. Kids sometimes respond differently to different people, and so we have that on our side, and I want to say that. I know that. There's also a really great thing that happens with positive peer pressure. When the whole group is getting in the water and you have this new friend or this person that you want to, be with because you enjoy them, because they also like Pokemon or Magic the Gathering, you jump in the pool with them. So there is some stuff that we can do at camp that we recognize that at home you can't do, but everything else that we do at camp, you could probably replicate at home. For example, we are very scheduled at camp, and I know Aspire is very similar to Akeela. We preview everything, and we have a schedule that we stick with. This is a schedule that I sort of recreated when COVID started, because I was encouraging our Akeela families to get their kids on a schedule during, COVID time schooling by using the camp schedule. So schedules and routines are not just helpful for health and wellness, but they also help establish a sense of control. And for children who are black and white thinkers, like many children on the autism spectrum, for example, feeling like they know what to expect helps them reduce their sense of anxiety and gives them a sense of control. They feel safer, less anxious because they know what's next. And when we have the same schedule no matter what, the health piece is important. Our bodies allow us to sleep better. When we're eating at a regulated time, our bodies operate better in terms of when we're going to the bathroom, which helps with sleep, and it's all sort of a cycle. So there's physiological reasons to have kids on a schedule as well. And then the big one is really creating a life skill, helping our children recognize that when they can set some limits and in terms of a schedule for themselves, they're able to stay on task and get things accomplished that they want to get accomplished. And I know Elise is going to show some visuals later that would be helpful for you to create a schedule at home. Something else that we do at camp is we create bunk expectations. And you can do this at home by having family expectations. Now, just between us, this is just a nicer way of saying family rules, but kids don't like rules all the time. Sometimes our kids do, but we use the word expectations to be a little bit friendlier. It's important that you as a family and as parents really set the expectations around not just behaviors, but what are the values that we have within our shared sort of family community? What do we expect of one another? What's important to us? And when we do that, then we can always reference back to those. So when people are having a hard time with something, why there's an expectation, we can go back to the fact that we had a family meeting. We might have posted these in people's, bedrooms or in the kitchen or in the dining room, and we can always reference back to them. That's an expectation that we all came up with as a family, and so that's why I'm asking you to do that task now. One other thing that we use at camp that might be helpful for you is a very basic behavioral principle. It's called in psychology the PREMAC principle, but it's really an if-then principle. And it allows kids to recognize that there are positive consequences for getting work done first. So if you walk the family dog for 20 minutes, then when you get back from walking the dog, you can have your 20 minutes of screen time. Really understanding that screen time, this message gives kids an understanding that screen time is a privilege, and in order to have that privilege, I need to earn it by pitching in with the family and helping them do a task that everyone benefits from. So that's something we use for little things and bigger things like, again, screen time or a chore. And finally, we like to use what we call guided choices. Again, our campers who are probably, have a neurodiverse profile do better when there's not unlimited amount of choice. If I say to a child at camp, what would you like to do today? There's so many choices that oftentimes our kids get stuck in not knowing where to start. So we like to just give them two choices. You can do your homework before you shower or after you shower. And I always say you get to choose. She's still going to do her homework and she's still going to shower. I don't care in what order she does it. And so I'm giving that choice to her. That's an option that she can feel like she has control over. And so I'm getting my goals met, which is to have a child who's clean and has her work done. And she gets to feel like she has some control over her life because she's deciding when to do it. So those are just a few things that we do at camp that allow our kids to meet their goals and to really feel like they have some ownership of what's going on in their life. So remember that setting limits really give your kids a sense of control and safety. And in the end, they really learn that life skill through the practice. You're establishing the guidelines and the framework, and they're doing the rest of it themselves.
Thanks, Debbie. Well, it's a pleasure to come in after that explanation because I think it's incredibly difficult, and it's, we've made a life's work of trying to explain why limits matter. So I'm just consistently impressed with your ability to break this down in a way that's relatable. So I'll get back to my visuals because what I am tasked with is so what does this look like in my home? And in no way are we suggesting that you make your home a therapy space or make your home look like camp, because we certainly, home is home. And at the end of the day, back to basics is something that I think we're all very much on the same page about. And what we do know is that the executive functioning system, so the system that controls memory, initiation, follow through, really that task, goal-oriented skill set to engage in expectations and live within them, that the executive functioning skill set is very well supported by visuals. And I think visuals get a bad name because people think that they're just checklists, they're just schedules. And I think that people can also think that there's a point where you age out. Right? Well, my kid's 12, I can't use visuals with him, her, them anymore. And what we want to do in the next couple of slides is just give you some examples of how to make information visual in a way that gets the job done. What does my child need help remembering? So that you can think about ways to make a non-condescending visual. I also think, I won't get too far into this soapbox, but I think that's also a cultural and a societal thing, that right now in a lot of our school support and in other settings, I hear a lot that the goal of independence is to get to the point that we're doing things without the visual, or that we're doing things without these external supports. And I wouldn't survive a day in the life of an adult without my lists and all of my technology to help me organize my executive functioning system. So I also think that one checkpoint tonight could also be, the goal is not to get rid of the visual. The goal is to help your child have a healthy relationship with this visual so they can interact with it in a way that helps them get the job done. So a couple of visual tools here, and a rule that I have when sorry, if you can go back one more, Eric. A rule that I have about visuals is there should only be information on the visual if your child understands what that means. So if we're talking about a younger child that won't have number sense, things that go in order 1, 2, 3, 4, that's not worth taking time on the visual. Because if I can say this, our population can be detail oriented. And so we only want them to have information that has meaning to them, nothing that can send this train off the tracks. So these are a couple of different visual supports that represent a couple of different skills your child might need support with. On the right, you see we have a sequence of visual images about a way that you could brush your teeth. Up top, we have a sequence list of a morning routine. So if this has numbers on it, then the order of those things matter. At the bottom, we have another example of a visual where there's time involved. Only put time down there if time matters. There are very good reasons where time might matter, like in order to get out the house on time, in order to have time to walk the dog. But we only want to work with time if it is a productive tool, and by productive I mean that very slight increase into fight or flight that motivates us to do things, not something that works against your child. And then on the other side, we have a checklist that will involve your child checking this off. So it is a great support sometimes, especially for our younger kids, to have engage and interact with their visuals, have a motor component there so that they can self-monitor as they're moving through it. So this is another really, I think, an underused approach to visual supports, which is to help our kids move from being really detail-oriented into seeing the whole picture. So I have to imagine we've all shared the experience where your child might say to you, "Oh, I can't find my sock," and it could not be closer to their body, right? It is next to in fact, it could even be on the foot. And so our kids tend to miss the forest for the vein on the leaf of the tree, or the aphid hanging off the bottom of the leaf on, halfway through the forest. So I think it is really important when we're talking about setting limits that we use limits that are about the whole picture, the schema, the gestalt of this experience. So 2 examples of how to do that these are visual images taken of the expectation here. What these visuals include are the specifics of what's included what's the specifics of what would bring our perspectives together. So I expect that your bedroom looks like this when you're done. We're going to come together around this visual. I think one thing that Debbie pointed out earlier is just how uncomfortable it can be for the caregiver to watch your child be uncomfortable. And sometimes I think that's because the caregiver is the keeper of the information. The caregiver is the gatekeeper. I'm going to be the one that tells you when you're done and when you've met the expectation. And as much as possible, if we can get the caregiver and the child on the same side, using a visual support as the gatekeeper of whether or not not the limit was met or whether the task was done. That's so important for your relationship. You're working together against the task. So this example of a bedroom here is one that we could create for a teenager. We take a picture of the finished product and then we break it down to the details. So an example of how to use this might be you send your child up to organize their room, and this is a limit that we are going to push through. You are, as Debbie mentioned earlier, if you take that half clean bedroom one time, you have to know what you're up against in terms of how that impacted your long-term ability to interact over this limit. So your child says, I'm done. And you say, okay, instead of you walking into the room and saying, that's not done, that's not done, that's not done, which we've all done, you pull out the visual and you say, does it match? I think anything that we can do to get back to data, that prefrontal cortex, instead of that emotional response, any sentence that starts with you, done. I'm not listening anymore, right? I'm in my limbic system. I can't hear it. So this visual helps us compare the existing data to what we've agreed is the expectation to bind the limit. And the other visual here is just an example of what might be for a younger child. There's a picture of the finished product on the outside, and then on the inside are the lists of the smaller details so that you can use whichever support would be helpful to create this agreed upon expectation and follow through by setting the limit. You can do this. You have this skill set. These tools will help you do it, instead of you acting as kind of the prosthetic frontal lobe to pull them through every step of the way. And then the last thing we have here are just a couple of more examples. We have rubrics for what does it look like to clear the table. These are skill sets that you have an image in your mind. Maybe a picture won't do it well, but we can take your schema of this skill, this task, and we can organize it in a way so that, again, your child finishes clearing the table, you realize it's not done. Instead of you being the gatekeeper and kicking off what might be a bit of a confrontation, now we're getting into compliance, now we're getting into more of this emotional power struggle territory. That makes it about you and your relationship instead of the task. So to follow through on the limit, then we say something like, well, let's get out the rubric. I don't mean to paint a picture that, you throw a visual on it and all of a sudden your child's going to be like, sure, absolutely, let me go clear the table and do that perfectly. I do think, however, over time, using visual tools really do help your child separate their relationship with you from the task that you are helping them build towards independence in. And then on the right here, some quality control measures. This is just a touch into the academic domain because we get asked about this all the time. I think it's going back to this piece of confidence and competence. One thing that I suggest specific to quality control measures is to take samples of your child's work when it does meet quality. I'm not saying you wait for the unicorn of the assignment where it checks all of the boxes for formatting and legibility and you showed your work in math. But it's likely when your child does an assignment, they met one or two pieces of the quality control expectations within that assignment. We hold that, we take a picture of it, and we keep a quality control log so that the next time your child does some academic work and the expectation is to do it to quality, we're going to hold that limit. Instead of me or the teacher telling you what to go fix, we go back to work where you've shown you can do this. You're holding yourself accountable to your own expectations. And I should say at the end of this, I think there's a certain extent where if you've implemented visuals, you've done some prompting, and you get to the end, there are situations where your child has choice. And that's a piece that I think we just have to acknowledge is another bit of this nuance. And that's going to be a smaller proportion of these experiences than I think we think it is. So some helpful hints, I think especially given the population that Akeela and MGH Aspire have in common. Using preferred interests to build an analogy. If your child really understands why cars and subway systems have to be oiled, why the car has to be maintained a certain way, compare that to the body for hygiene. Subway routines and maps, compare that to the organization of a schedule and family systems. Whenever possible, break the task down with your child. There's a huge disconnect when we know how a task is supposed to be done and we just give the visual to our child. We also need to help empower them and educate them to see how we're breaking down that task into the tools that support it. When possible, create the tools collaboratively and ask your child for feedback. Where will you absolutely, definitely see this in the bathroom? On top of the toilet lid? Okay, let's give that a shot. It may not pan out that way in the end, but at least you gave them a chance to have the experience of their own suggestion. So without further ado, I would love to hand this over to Eric, who's been monitoring our chat, to share any patterns and questions. And Eric will direct a question to either Debbie or myself, and we're looking forward to seeing if we can make any of this make sense to you.
Wonderful. Thank you guys very much. Just a reminder for those of you who have not been following the chat, there's lots of things to look at this evening. But rather than open up all the microphones, we'd love to have your questions. We have several minutes left, and if you just pop into the chat, do a private chat to me, Eric, type it in, I will get it to the speakers. So the first question is about new activities. Debbie spoke about this earlier, so maybe we'll direct this to Debbie first. How do I keep my child encouraged to try new activities when she doesn't master them right away? So we keep saying everything takes patience, be gentle with yourself, but she refuses to persevere and then feels bad about herself, and then we as parents also feel like we failed. And I think a tack onto that question, because I think Debbie then said, one way that we do this at camp is with positive peer pressure. All the other kids are doing it, so I'm going to do it too. Some of these kids, I think this one in particular, it doesn't seem like she even really responds well to peer pressure.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, maybe you're trying this already, the parent who asked this question, but, I think that breaking tasks down and allowing a child to feel some mastery of some piece of a task that's larger is really helpful. So, for example, at camp, and I reference camp just because, we've been doing it for 14 years at Akeela. And so that's where, I can give you concrete examples. But for a lot of our kids, the notion of getting into a lake that's cold and, has fish in it and might have a bottom that is squishy under their feet is often a huge task that they don't necessarily know how to start. And so their initial reaction is no. A lot of times for us, the first step is really just getting them to go down to the lake and watch how other people respond. And I think Elise mentioned that as a task also. And then maybe it's that, the first time we do something, we do it together. So as a parent, I might take my daughter and we might walk in the lake together. And we might do that a few times until she feels comfortable. And then the next time, maybe I stay back on the beach and she walks in by herself, but she can see me. So those are the types of things that we try and do. Peer pressure obviously is not a great thing when it's negative. At camp it becomes a positive, but I recognize for a lot of our kids when they're not at camp, they don't necessarily have a huge peer group. And so I think that that's something that's unique to camp, which is what I was saying, was sort of a unicorn about camp that is not necessarily a reality in other settings. But I would say break down the task and then when possible, do the steps with your child until they feel confident enough to master that on their own.
Thank you. Elise, we have a parent whose child is away at boarding school, 16-year-old, and it seems to be easier to set boundaries by phone. Like he'll ask for something and the parent will say, either no right away or I'm not going to answer that right now. I will let you know later. And like the child seems to accept that, goes on his way. It's all great. But he's coming home soon for the holidays. And there's a question of, can I keep that up once he's here at home with me? That seems to be a concern. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, it's such a great question. I wish I were more optimistic that I would tell you something that will be effective when you try it. I think I could give a couple of suggestions that just might empower you to think about what you could try. I think that one thing that I think about a lot is for a population who has to put what we might say is a little more cognitive effort into managing social interactions, it doesn't surprise me that it's very hard to manage stress and be socially competent at the same time. So I think it is really realistic for our population for us to, when there's going to be a conversation where the content of the conversation is most important, that we allow ourselves to separate that. That we say, listen, I can have this conversation through text message, I can have this conversation through email, through Google Chat, I can write it on sticky notes, we can write it down, and to normalize the opportunity for us all to have conversations where if the content is most important, we can, for our population, we can, I don't want to say remove, but I think we can lessen and not doubly tax that real-time social competency brain at the same time we're giving information that might be unpreferred. That's not to say that we don't work towards putting these two together. So I also think that what I would pair that with is kind of talking as a family, as Debbie said earlier, about setting family expectations, talking with your child about having the long-term goal, letting them know what that experience is like for you. Maybe when they're really calm, you could do a relaxing activity like a puzzle and open up the conversation and talk about the fact that, I noticed when you're away at school, it was really interesting to me that it seemed like if you and I were talking about something that might bother one of the other of us, that it actually was okay and we could accept the other one's answer. I'm a little nervous to try to talk to you when we're at home because sometimes it seems like you get really upset if I don't give the answer that you were expecting. Now that was a speed through version of the conversation, but I think that having transparent conversations with our kids and letting them know your perspective in a way that's not beating them down, but it's modeling perspective taking and clarifying for them what your experience of it is.
Wonderful, thank you. There's a question that came in that I'm going to answer quickly by just saying we'll get back to you. So great question about are there any books or other resources that you guys can recommend that would go further into this content, maybe even including some examples of schedules and visuals. CampLauncher will send a follow-up email. We will get some advice from Debbie and Elise about maybe some resources we might be able to put in that email that we can point folks to. Also, our child doesn't have a ton of personal interests. A lot of these kids, this is Eric talking again, we can't hardly pull them away from their book or their research or their TV shows or their computers. This is a family actually who would like their kid to have a little bit more independent time and are finding that even if they let her kind of watch TV or encourage her to do a puzzle, 5 minutes later she's back and wanting to spend time with them. Debbie, we're very familiar with this phenomenon in our house. Any thoughts?
I was hoping you were going to ask Elise to answer this one. I was going to get her professional advice. No, Eric's referring to our own 7-year-old who is a very social being who does not like to be alone. And I think some kids are like that. I think it's not necessarily about interest. Sometimes it's about helping children recognize the importance of having downtime and having space for themselves. And again, that's another way that people are uncomfortable, right? Those people who feel anxious when they're not near or close to or spending time with the people they care about, and maybe that's part of what's going on for this child, that can be really challenging and uncomfortable. And like I said before, uncomfortable is not safe. So really setting a time limit for this child to be on their own, and maybe it's just 10 minutes for a little bit or 15 and they have a visual clock so that they can see how much time is left. They might discover some interest or ways to entertain themselves if they're just pushed to have to do it. And I think a lot of times as parents, we feel like we constantly have to engage with our kids because that's what we've been told by society is expected of us. But in reality, I think it's really helpful for us to force our children to be independent sometimes or be alone sometimes. And it just takes practice like anything else. So we start with a small chunk of 10 or 15 minutes, and maybe that grows. But I think kids can figure out what to do if they're just given the opportunity to have that space. And I don't know if Elise has anything else to add, but that's sort of my take from a psychology perspective.
Yeah, Debbie, I echo everything. I think one thing I found interesting over the years is this idea of what do I like is really hard. So when I'm doing transition planning with individuals, and sometimes there's an IEP goal, like this individual will state 3 things they can find in their community to fill their leisure time. It's hard. I think especially with the introduction of technology, because screens are not an interest, they're a vehicle for your interest. And that's a really hard physiological experiment where the screen is giving you the dopamine. It doesn't give our kids as much of an experience in real life to say this gave me more dopamine, this gave me less, because just the vehicle of the screen makes that relationship between you and the activity and dopamine wonky. So dopamine is the hormone that allows you to feel reward and success, and it's what drives us and keeps us coming back to things. So one other thing I'll add, I think that multiple intelligence inventories can be a really interesting way to get your child thinking about what do I like. They're very structured, and there are different iterations of them. So multiple intelligences are a thing about Howard. They're from Howard Gardner out of Harvard, and he basically said that we can take concepts in our minds. We can take our experience of the world and potentially break it down into what we like naturalistic intelligence, mathematical intelligence. So if you do a quick search online, you can find kid-friendly multiple intelligence inventories where your kid can answer questions about themselves, and it'll spit out things like, you might enjoy a walk in the woods. And I think for our population that struggles a little bit with self-reflection and abstract thinking, having those things to just hang into a little bit can be helpful for the structure.
Great.
Thanks, guys. We have time for one last question. And the question is, if I'm reading it correctly, and I hope I am, I think this parent is following your advice, finding the right calm moment to approach their child with a request or a question. And it sounds like even if the child is calm at the beginning of the conversation, it escalates very quickly to him or her shouting, "I don't know!" And then there's high emotion and just sort of, a lack of engagement and really just sort of like, I don't know kind of behavior. Elise.
Without knowing more, I think it's possible they don't. And so I'm not sure that this is a match for the situation, but I wonder about separating dealing with the dysregulation of the conversation from solving the problem. So once you take a turn into dysregulation, changing the focus of the conversation from the original point, which was like, well, what do you want for dinner tonight? And once your child is dysregulated, just moving into, oh, whoa, you're really mad. I just asked you a question. And then that's where that goal ends. The goal is deregulation instead of, which I do this all the time still, and I teach this, is, wow, you're really mad that I asked you a question. So and then we bring back the executive functioning need. And so I think there's a lot of space for us to separate the deregulation. This is a model called whole brain child. Dr. Siegel and Tina Payne Bryson, big fan of it, and it kind of gives us some scripts to separate the re-regulation from the other skill set, which is executive functioning, problem solving, which may just be offline in that moment. Debbie?
Yeah, I totally agree.
Stop, but quick follow-up on that question. I got some clarification from the original questioner. This most happens when given a choice. Please choose between such and such. I don't know.
I mean, again, without knowing even more specific, I think that if it really doesn't matter, you can say, this seems like it's really hard for you. This time I'm going to choose. And you can sort of do that in the moment, especially if it's a time sensitive, thing. You have to prepare dinner or you have to go somewhere. Certainly making a choice if the child is really fine with both and it won't be an issue. So I've done that before with children. And then I think important, sort of the other piece, Elise and I totally agree with each other. We were talking about this the other day, not talking to a child or trying to repair something with a child when they're escalated, but really taking the time later on to go back and revisit that when they are not escalated. So it was really hard for you to make a choice in that moment. Those types of things are going to come up. They've been coming up a lot. When it comes up again next time, how can I help you? And how can you help yourself? What would be better for you next time? So making sure that you're revisiting it, not in that moment, but later on.
Thank you. I think we're going to wrap up. Elise, can you mention for us one last time that site where it suggests activities that might be interesting for you?
Oh, the multiple intelligence inventory? Maybe we could put that in. I'm not going to pull it accurately from my memory right now, but maybe we could put that into the follow-up.
Yeah. You want to look up Howard Gardner. I used to walk by his office every day. Very cool guy. Excellent. All right. Thank you. That is the end of this evening's program. We're going to go back to Jeffrey for a quick wrap-up.
Thanks, Eric. And thank you, Elise. Thank you, Debbie. That was really fantastic. And I also want to thank you all for participating in this webinar. We at Camp Launcher hope that this, and expect actually, this is not the last one of these we will do. In fact, we hope to be able to announce very soon an upcoming webinar, which we think will be in February. Again, very timely, very important topic by one of our colleagues and expert in the field, and we'll keep you informed of that. Again, with this information that's up here, I just want to remind you, if you're aware of people who need our support, please reach out to us. And similarly, if you feel you are able to support us or know people who might, again, please reach out to us. And with that, I will say goodnight, and to all of you and to all of your families, please stay safe and stay healthy.